Welcome everybody to this webinar with Drake Williams. My name is Jose and I'm here to help set everything up and help if you experience any technical issues. In case you don't know Drake, let me introduce him. Drake Williams serves as Associate Professor of New Testament at Evangelische Theologische Faculteit in Leuven, Belgium. And he has written or been involved in editing 6 books. He and his wife are active in mission work with the European Christian Mission of North America. And he has also taught on the mission field at Tyndale Theological Seminary in the Netherlands, in Almaty, Kazakhstan, and in Romania at Colegiul Biblic Est European and the Baptist Institute at Bucharest State University. Drake serves as Minister of Mission and Theology at the Central Felder Church in Worcester, and Drake and his wife Andrea reside in North Wales, Pennsylvania. And I'm very sorry about all those names, probably pronounced wrong. Those are really hard. Yeah, so this is a small introduction of Drake. So Drake, feel free to start your presentation.
Thank you very much, Jose. It's nice to be able to do this with you again. You've been wonderful to work with in the past. I look forward to this time with you, as well as everybody else who's tuned in to talk about empathy, exploring a Christian foundation of a valuable emotion in 2 Corinthians. Well, I'm speaking to you today from near Philadelphia, Pennsylvania in the States. I hope that things are fine with you where you are in your part of the world. We're going to talk about empathy for a bit today. If I can get the slides going. And I thought it's always helpful, I think, to when one's talking about a topic, just to share a little bit how one plugs into it. My interest in empathy came from working with youth. My wife Andrea and I have worked with youth through Campus Crusade for Christ for a number of years, as well as in various places in Europe. We used to host a youth meeting in our house while we lived in the Netherlands for some 13 years. They would come over on Friday night, and we would have a time of just time to eat together, a time to catch up with them, play a few games, and then also to talk with them about things, Christian things, or things in the life of the church. It was very enjoyable. But I also became aware that youth were changing from my time as being a youth many years ago. And they're changing in so many different ways, and they're exposed to things that I just never was exposed to growing up. One of these was technology, and the way that is changing the ways that people communicate and people share about life. And I wanted to understand that better for the youth that I was working with, but then also for my children. I have 3 children I'm very proud of. My eldest son, Henry, is married and living away from us now, of course. Our daughter, Abby, is in Atlanta at Emory University in her sophomore year. And then my son, my youngest son, Sam, is finishing up his secondary school education this year. But I wanted to understand my children better, of course, to empathize with them, but then also to appreciate the ways that technology, as well as the world, is changing the ways that we relate. So that's how I started getting interested in this topic. And then along came, I should say, as a New Testament scholar, I also find myself interested in Paul's letters, the way that they communicate emotion too, and finding that technology may change the way that we evaluate these letters. Helpful to know the ways that emotions are affecting us and the ways that they help us look at written material as well. So that's my entree into this. And then along came a conference at the school where I serve as a professor, Evangelische Theologische Fakulteit in Leuven, Belgium. The conference was entitled Moral Discernment in an Age of Complex Technology. And I submitted a paper to about text messages and the ways that they affect the way that we empathize one with another. And I'm happy to say that part of this presentation has been accepted in their volume on Christian perspectives on leadership and social ethics through Peter's Press. So that's how I enter into this discussion today. Let's talk about empathy. It's a word that's been bandied about in public life quite a bit over the last number of years. I could refer to a number of talks that have been either on the BBC or a number of books that have been written about empathy or articles. But let's take a quotation from Barack Obama. Former President Barack Obama had a number of things to say about empathy, and they're rather catching. So here's one of the things that he said about empathy, and he was speaking this to graduates at the University of Massachusetts in Boston on June the 2nd, 2006. He was encouraging the graduates in this way: cultivate a sense of empathy, to put yourself in other people's shoes, to see the world from their eyes. And then as he goes on through his charge to the graduates on that day, he says, empathy is a quality of character that can change the world, one that makes you understand that your obligations to others extend beyond people who look like you and act like you and live in your neighborhood. Well, former President Barack Obama spoke about empathy several times, not only at this graduation speech, but in other places. Here's another spot where he spoke about empathy. This at a student roundtable, this time taking place in Istanbul, Turkey. And he said, learning to stand in somebody else's shoes, to see through their eyes, that's how peace begins. And it's up to you to make that happen. Empathy is a quality of character that can change the world. But this is just one of many popular statements about empathy that are circulating now around the globe. How does empathy, this emotion that can change the world, though, fit in with other things that are happening in the world, such as technology? We have an ever-growing increase in communication by technology. This is something I'm getting used to now, having a smartphone over these past few years, having a cell phone, of course, going back a number of years, but a smartphone by which we frequently communicate in the family as well as the church where I serve. We are now entered into a culture that is so pervasive in its use of technology and social media, particularly in text messages. And people have been finding that this affects the way that we communicate emotionally one with the other. So how many texters are there in the world? 5.035 billion of them. That's a lot of people using text message communication. If you're in the United States, it's 277 million texters in the United States, although that statistic from Text Request wasn't measuring children 12 years older and younger, who were probably quite quick with their thumbs to and able to communicate by text. Median number of texts sent, this just by American teens, was 60 per day. That's quite frequent, the ways that these texts have been communicated, 60 per day. And at least 97% of smartphone owners text regularly. That is stat coming from the Pew Research Center. So the ways that we communicate are very different now by text, but empathy is part of the world, something of a valued emotion. How do we evaluate the means that we are communicating one with another? And should we evaluate the ways that we communicate one with the other? Well, once again, people are calling for the evaluation of technology, how important it is to know the ways that we are communicating as that affects the message that we're sending. Marshall McLuhan, a number of years ago in Understanding Media, The Extensions of Man, wrote, "The medium is the message." And ironically, he was applying this to movies, that movies affect the way that we communicate messages one with the other. He was imploring us back in 1964, well before text messages, well before smartphones, that the medium by which we communicate affects the message. In a book in 1993, written by Neil Postman, a sociologist, he wrote this about evaluating technology and also the ways that it affects us as human beings. Technology can destroy the vital sources of humanity. It creates a culture without moral foundation and reorders our fundamental assumptions about the world at large. The uncontrolled growth of technology destroys the vital sources of our humanity. And of course, that could be applied to the way we communicate by text message, and could also affect the ways that we evaluate things emotionally and affect the way that we look at empathy. Finally, Dr. Sherry Turkle, in her book, The Second Self, Computers and the Human Spirit, says, technology catalyzes changes not only in what we do, but in how we think. It offers the illusion of companionship. And that, of course, will affect the ways that we empathize one with the other. So we have these various strands in society now. We're communicating more frequently by text. We have empathy that is a valued emotion, but we have also a means by which we're communicating that is frequently not evaluated. So we're going to try and put all these things together in the next several minutes as we walk through this presentation, evaluating the ways that we communicate empathetically, and text messages handle this, and how then might we be able to encourage empathy? We'll look at that at the very end. So the goals of the presentation: summarize some findings about text messages in relation to the emotion of empathy, compare with an ancient source of the communicated empathy that Paul's writing in 2 Corinthians 1-7, and then finally making some suggestions for increasing empathy from these findings. Let's start with a definition. How do we define empathy? What does empathy look like? Here we go to the Encyclopedia of Social Psychology, where they have this definition of empathy. Empathy is about understanding another person's experience by imagining oneself in that other person's situation. One understands the other person's experience as if it were being experienced by the self, but without the self actually experiencing it. The distinction is maintained between self and the other. So it's about understanding somebody else's experience as best as we can, but without experiencing it directly ourselves. We have to distinguish between ourselves and the other person's means of experience. That's also part of empathy. So it builds bridges, but there are also some boundaries to it. It's a complex emotion. Now, defining empathy. This from Susan Lanzoni's book, Empathy, A History. It involves understanding another, just like our previous definition from the Journal of Social Psychology. Empathy takes place between self and another, building boundaries, but also a bridge. And it's a paradoxical emotion because an empathetic person is able to project oneself to be something other than himself. So standing in somebody else's shoes, it's concerned with understanding and communicating that understanding to another, but not being completely in that other's situation, although trying to be there as much as possible. It's different from sympathy. Sympathy is another emotion that is valuable in this day and age. Many have written about sympathy, but sympathy means having sorrow for someone else's experience, while empathy involves being able to appreciate the feelings of another, building a bridge, yet maintaining a boundary. It's differentiated from projecting one's feelings onto a situation. One can't just say that's the way I would feel. It's trying to understand how the other person feels in their situation. It's trying to understand when the emotion is being appreciated by that other person. Would they say that we understand them by the way that we are feeling? That would be empathy. Groups can express empathy, but also individuals can do so as well. Sometimes it's helpful to go to a more popular illustration. This from Harper Lee's book, To Kill a Mockingbird from 1962. And I think you'll see in this quote from one of the main characters in To Kill a Mockingbird, that being Atticus Finch. He's talking to his daughter, who is called Scout throughout the novel. And you'll see empathy just in the way he expresses this to his daughter. If you can learn a simple trick, Scout, you'll get along a lot better with all kinds of folks. You never really understand a person until you consider things from his point of view, until you climb inside of his skin and walk around in it. Good quote about empathy, appreciating the other person for what he or she is experiencing. It builds a bridge, but then also maintains a boundary. Okay. Now, with that as a definition, let's try and look at several studies on text messages. Do they allow us to build that bridge? Do they allow us to walk around in somebody else's skin for a while? Here we're going to look at several studies that have come out about text messaging and communication in the last number of years. Now, if you've text messaged or have received text messages, you'll be quite familiar with these pictures on the screen: emoticons and emojis. They smile, they have hearts, they have tears, or sometimes a lot of tears. Sometimes they act surprised or amazed. Well, 74% of Americans regularly use these stickers, emoticons, or emojis in their online communication. Americans send an average of 96 emojis or stickers per day. Quite a frequent way of communicating emotion within text messages. These messages usually have 6 or 7 words per time that they are sent, but then oftentimes somebody will attach an emoticon or an emoji to hopefully enhance the communication. But these become a unique challenge for empathy. Text messages are frequently sent and quickly, and there's a lot of speed behind the text message. The frequent use of emojis or emoticons may help, but then studies have also been released where they might confuse. For example, there was a study done of students in Heerlen in the Netherlands, and they worked with several thousand students, and they evaluated the text message that was being sent. And sometimes it would have the emoticon or emoji afterwards. Sometimes it would enhance it. The smile enhancing a positive message, or the tear causing enhancing the sadness of the message. But sometimes the emoticon or the emoji would confuse. So 6 or 7 words, which rather brief, but then the emoticon or emoji following afterwards would confuse the recipient, making it more difficult to express or to have the same emotion as the recipient would be expected to receive. That's coupled with another phenomenon that's been happening with so many people texting and so many people being connected to the internet. There's several studies that have been released that have shown that the emotion of empathy is decreasing. A study released in a journal called Personality and Social Psychology Review has suggested that among university students, American university students, in the past 20 years, empathy levels have dropped by about 40%. This study looked at 13,000 students from the 1980s, 1990s, and into just the beginning of 2000, and found empathy levels dropping off a fair amount. In another study from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, they evaluated emotions and through text messages in one of the chapters in this book, Alone Together, and found that emotions were frequently underdeveloped. Thumbs up, thumbs down can be frequent ways that one communicates emotions through social media, whether it be text messages or through instant message or over something like Facebook. And emotions were found to be underdeveloped rather than a yay, thumbs up, or a nay, thumbs down. Emotional connection was also found to be diminished when people pick up cell phones on average every 6.5 minutes. This leads to disjointed conversations and difficult to express some of the complex emotions, like, for example, that of empathy. Even the presence of a cell phone could be seen as undercutting deeper conversations. Some in this study by Dr. Sherry Turkle, Alone Together, Why We Expect More from Technology and Less from Each Other. Just the presence of a cell phone on the table would lead to conversations being broken up, undercutting the ability to share deeper things. Furthermore, as one is communicating via these text messages or through smartphones, the study showed that multitasking was increasing. And with multitasking came a lesser ability to show emotional involvement with other people. One other study came out, this through the health organization Cigna, along with Ipsos. It was a survey of more than 20,000 Americans 18 years of age and older. Nearly half of Americans reported sometimes or always feeling alone or left out. 46% feeling alone, 47% feeling left out. Cigna was noting that shows a culture that seems to be becoming more and more isolated one from another. 1 in 4 Americans rarely or never feel as though there are people who really understand them. Interestingly, in the same study, Generation Z, which was ages 18 through about 22, is the loneliest generation in America today, and claims to be in worse health than older generations. And now adding an interpretation to this, it's an interesting correlation here that people are feeling lonelier in a younger generation that is more connected than ever via social media, via text messages and the like. Could it be that there is something within the ways that we are communicating one with another that is prohibiting emotion and prohibiting means of deeper emotion like empathy from taking place from one to another? At least from these several studies, it seems that there's something there about that. Now we're going to try and compare empathy by going back in time a little bit. Since work with ancient texts, I wanted to take us back in time to try and compare how empathy was communicated many years ago. I'm going to have us eventually go to a text within the Bible written by the Apostle Paul to a group of people that he is trying to encourage them to connect with him emotionally and to empathize. But we need to just take a few minutes and see if we can speak about emotion in general. What goes into emotion? What comprises emotion? There have been several studies that have tried to analyze emotion, and they break it down in this way. So we're going to try and analyze the emotion before then making the comparison with 2 Corinthians 1-7 with text messages today. So here are 5 aspects that govern emotions. There's a cognitive aspect to emotion, knowing that there's an emotion taking place. There's a feeling aspect, of course, to emotion, referring to a particular emotional experience. There's a motivation that goes with emotion, consisting of action tendencies or state of readiness to act it out. There's a somatic, or in other words, a bodily aspect of emotion, consisting of central and peripheral psychological responses. And then finally, a motor aspect consisting of expressive behavior, facial expressions. That might be a little theoretical, but let's just process it through an emotion like anger. Somebody might say something to us in a meeting or with a friend or in the family, and cognitively we know that makes me angry. Something's upsetting me. And the feeling might come up. You might feel something coming up within from your heart up to your mind as you start to feel angry. You might be motivated to then act it out, and might be able to find the motivation that is triggered the emotion of anger. Your body might have a somatic reaction. Your face might get red, your cheeks might get tense, and then hopefully you don't act this out, but maybe it's a motor response, and maybe you want to lash out with your arm or with your hand, or express something that you wish you wouldn't say later. But these can all be ways that anger would be then acted out and categorized. There's cognitive, there's a feeling, there's a motivation, there's a bodily response, and a possible action. Now, it's hard for us to be able to compare all of these things with an ancient text, but we can examine it though in this way. There is a stimulus, there's somebody who's writing, trying to get a reaction. There's some appraisal from which we can look at the recipients as to how they're receiving the emotion. And then there might be an action that comes out afterwards that the writer is wanting, or the response that is envisioned. So we're going to look at now 2 Corinthians in these ways. What is Paul trying to say? What is he expecting the Corinthians to understand, and what action does he want from these, and from what he's written? And we'll see that he's encouraging a deep sense of empathy in this passage in 2 Corinthians 1-7. A little backdrop to Paul as he has written the Corinthians. It's a letter embedded in a great history. Many years ago in AD 50 or AD 49, Paul visited the ancient city of Corinth, founded the church there. And it was a bit of a tumultuous time, as you can find if you want to do some further reading in Acts 18. It wasn't an easy time that he had founding the church there in Corinth. He goes away from Corinth after 50 AD, after staying a year and a half, 18 months, which is a lengthy amount of time for him. And after he's on his way, he then writes back to the church in Corinth in AD 53. He then receives delegates from the church in Corinth that say something's not right. There's some division and some problems. And then in AD 55, he writes the letter of 1 Corinthians. He then leaves from where he is to go off to Ephesus, and sends a dear friend of his, Timothy, to be with the church in Corinth. And Timothy reports back to Paul that things really aren't going very well at all, and that the previous letter didn't have a good effect. So Paul has a painful visit with the Corinthians in AD 55. In response to this, he writes what many believe to be the severe or tearful letter. We don't have a copy of it, but we know that Paul speaks of there being a severe or tearful letter, an emotional letter that he wrote the Corinthians. And we don't know, at that point in time, he didn't know exactly how they responded to it. After he writes this letter, he has a deep tribulation where he experienced despairing of life, deep depression, and perhaps was near death's door. But he recovered from this and went on to visit in a city called Troas, and met up with another dear friend of his, Titus, who tells him indeed that the severe letter had had good effect, even though Paul had written it out of tears and trials that he had with the Corinthians. It had good effect. And now he writes 2 Corinthians in AD 56, some 6-7 years after he wrote the letter to the Corinthians, 6 or 7 years after he had founded the church back in 49-50 AD. see right from the get-go that Paul is going to encourage emotional bridge building with the Corinthians. There's this lovely section that opens up 2 Corinthians, and it goes like this. Blessed be the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, the Father of mercies and God of all comfort, who comforts us in all our affliction, so that we may be able to comfort those who are in any affliction, with the comfort with which we ourselves are comforted by God. For as we share abundantly in Christ's sufferings, so through Christ we share abundantly in comfort too. If we are afflicted, it's for your comfort and salvation. And if we are comforted, it is for your comfort, which you experience when you patiently endure the same sufferings that we write. Our hope for you is unshaken, for we know that as you share in our sufferings, you will also share in our comfort. What an encouraging beginning to a letter. God comforts us in all of our afflictions so that we might be able to comfort those who are in any affliction. He's working with emotions that they would be able to understand, comfort, affliction, building bridges right from the beginning. Paul would frequently write letters to his congregations and churches that he had contact with, but they weren't the introductions quite like this. If you want to look at a more formal introduction to his letters, consider Philippians 1, 3 through 9, where he starts with customary greetings and a Thanksgiving section, writing to people that he also knew fairly well, writing to a church that he was also involved with founding, but not like 2 Corinthians. No, Paul is starting off here by talking about comfort and helping us in affliction. And this becomes a bridge that he starts to begin to build with the Corinthians, showing that he cares for them and he wants them to also have that same type of emotional connection. Paul uses the word comfort, the Greek words paraklesis, 6 times in this passage, and he uses the verb for comfort too, parakaleo, 4 times. And he also builds a further connection besides just an emotional one or a relational one. He even points out that it's the God that they both worship is the God of comfort. That Paul's affliction that he has is for the Corinthians' comfort, and that the sufferings of Christ provide a mutual bridge for both of them to meet on as well. As the letter goes on, Paul continues to try and build an emotional connection, as he is the one trying to urge the Corinthians to have the same identification that he has with his emotions. 2 Corinthians 1, 8 through 11 goes like this. For we do not want you to be unaware, brothers, of the affliction we experienced in Asia. For we were so utterly burdened beyond our strength that we despaired of life itself. Indeed, we felt that we had received the sentence of death, but that was to make us rely not on ourselves, but on God who raises the dead. He delivered us from such a deadly peril, and he will deliver us. On him we have set our hope, that he will deliver us again. What do we see here? Paul sharing an experience, a great affliction, a trouble that he also hopes that the Corinthians will also take into account. Once again, trying to build a common emotional connection with the Corinthians, hoping that they will empathize with him. As the letter goes on, we read in 2 Corinthians 4, verses 7 through 12, again, another emotional bridge building time. But we have this treasure in jars of clay, and note, I'll comment on the underlined words in a moment, showing how these also help build the bridge. But we have this treasure in jars of clay to show that the surpassing power belongs to God and not to us. We are afflicted in every way, but not crushed, perplexed, but not driven to despair, persecuted, but not forsaken, struck down, but not destroyed, always carrying in the body the death of Jesus, so that the life of Jesus may also be manifested in our bodies. For we who live are always being given over to death for Jesus' sake, so that the life of Jesus also may be manifested in our mortal flesh. So death is at work in us, but life in you. We can see here mutual bridge building that's happening here. having a treasure in a jar of clay, a common entity that the Corinthians had, that Paul had, and picturing human existence like a fragile, brittle jar of clay, though containing something of great value. As you can see in verse 10 and verse 11, it's the sufferings in the body, or the sufferings that Paul experiences in this world, are given so that they might have an encouragement for the Corinthians in the future. So that death is at work in Paul, but that life will be at work in the Corinthians. Once again, building bridges emotionally. As we keep reading through 2 Corinthians, the identification continues as Paul is trying to connect with the Corinthians to tell them that he's their valid apostle, and that they should be wanting to follow after him. Here he provides a list of sufferings that he experiences in 2 Corinthians 6, verses 4 and 5, as well as 7 and 8 and 9 and 10. I think this is interesting. Paul could have talked about all of the great experiences that he had in this world. Experiences of even being on the road to Damascus and seeing the glorified Christ. But he builds the bridge through suffering. The list of hardships includes afflictions, as well as hardships, calamities, beatings, imprisonments, riots, labors, sleepless nights, and hunger. As he shares his own experience, he expects that the Corinthians will be able to say, aha, I identify with this. He is also praised and blamed that he brings before the Corinthians, hoping that they will once again identify with that. And then in verses 9 and 10 in chapter 6, he mentions his punishments, although not yet killed, sorrowful yet always rejoicing, poor yet making many others rich, and having nothing yet possessing everything. What a list he uses there to try and build the bridge from himself to the Corinthians, hoping that they will identify. But now as he moves into chapter 7, he will specifically look for an activity. No, actually, the end of chapter 6, and as well as chapter 7, he will look for an activity, and that being empathy. 2 Corinthians 6, verses 11 through 13. We have spoken freely to you, Corinthians. Our heart is wide open. You are not restricted by us, but you are restricted in your own affections. In return, I speak as to children. Widen your hearts also. That's an interesting command that he gives them in 2 Corinthians 6. Open up, brothers and sisters at Corinth. I have already talked with you about God being the God of all comfort, that my suffering is like those in this world as a jar of clay, that even though I'm being beaten down, my sufferings are for you. And now I will list my sufferings in chapter 6. And then in verse 13 of chapter 6, he specifically asks for them to act out an emotion. And that emotion is, widen your hearts, open them up to me. He will repeat himself, though, just a few verses later, 2 Corinthians 7, which also encourages empathy. 2 Corinthians 7, verses 1 through 3. Since we have these promises, beloved, let us cleanse ourselves from every defilement of body and spirit, bringing holiness to completion in the fear of God. Make room in your hearts for us. We have wronged no one. We have corrupted no one. We have taken advantage of no one. I do not say this to condemn you, for I said before that you are in our hearts to die together and to live together. Once again, an interesting commandment there. Make room in your hearts for us. Open up, as Paul has shared his suffering, which he hopes to which they will appreciate, to which he hopes that they will identify with, jars of clay too, and perhaps suffering in other ways that are similar to Paul, so they're not identically like that. But then Paul urging them to open up their hearts to empathize with him. Well, just a few key aspects here that have led up to this appeal for empathy in 2 Corinthians. Paul has had a lengthy relationship with the Corinthians. He hasn't been with them day to day for 7 years, but he has been with them. He stayed with them for 18 months. We know we have several visits that he made to Corinth. We have several letters. We have 2 in our New Testament, 1 Corinthians and 2 Corinthians, but we know that there is a letter written previous to 1 Corinthians, as well as a severe or tearful letter written between 1 and 2 Corinthians. So we know that he wrote many letters. Some of these were quite emotional. His time with them had involved, of course, day-to-day living, but also joys as well as heartaches. He appeals to suffering that he had had apart from them, but also with them. And he also appeals to a common identity in the death and resurrection of Christ. All of these lead up or affect or build a foundation or a basis for his plea for empathy, which the word I'm using in 2 Corinthians 6:13, as well as 2 Corinthians 7:2. Oh, that's an interesting ancient example. Now let's bring it back to discussions about empathy today, in light of also the ways that we're communicating by text messages. Empathy. It is a valued as well as a complex emotion. It is increasingly being encouraged throughout modern society, but it's also found in ancient society. We looked at 2 Corinthians 1-7, but there are many other ancient texts that encourage empathy as well. Empathy involves perceiving other people's feelings from their perspective, not from ours. It maintains a boundary between people, but also seeks to build a bridge. It's complex and it's not an easy thing to do. Text message communication struggles with complexity. In the studies that we looked at earlier in this webinar, there are problems with the brevity of a text message, the ambiguity of emoticons and emojis. They don't always produce the same emotion or the same effect that we would expect on the other end of the smartphone conversation. Cell phones and interruptions decrease the ability to communicate complex emotions one with another. And interestingly, loneliness and isolation are frequently bred through text message communication. We're seeing this, at least in studies released today. But empathy is all about encouraging people to build the emotional bridge, and the text message will struggle with that complexity. It could very well be, as Dr. Sherry Turkle, who has provided one of these surveys today, has said that we need to disconnect from media in order to connect with each other. I think that that's a reasonable conclusion, just from our evaluation of text messages. But from our comparison with 2 Corinthians, written communication can be a vehicle for increasing empathy. I think we've seen and demonstrated that empathy is expected within 2 Corinthians 1-7, where Paul has emotions he's trying to communicate to the Corinthians. He expects that they will be able to grasp them, and then he implores them to open wide their hearts. So it's not just written text that would be a block for empathy. In fact, written text can encourage and increase empathy. So it's not the written text that is the problem. If we're looking to increase empathy, though, in this modern world, 2 Corinthians 1-7 might provide some help or some guidelines. Because here, this text is one that is built, that comes from a lengthy relationship, a relationship that is up and down through many different years. But empathy is found within a lengthy relationship rather than a short and brief one. Common suffering helps build a bridge and helps to encourage reaching across one to another with empathy and appealing to identity in the death and resurrection of Christ will help to strengthen the bridge between Christians as we work out the common sufferings of the person of Christ. Like 2 Corinthians 1:5 says, these things can build a bridge for us in a world today looking for greater empathy, and hopefully an empathy that will help to change a very broken entire world in which we live. Thank you for listening to this presentation. I'll be very interested in your feedback as well as having some discussion about this complex emotion of empathy, as well as text messages and Paul's means of communicating empathy in his day and age.
Thank you very much, Drake, for your presentation on empathy. And I want to encourage anyone to write down your questions. There is a chat where you can write them down so that we can have them for discussion. We have some questions from the participants from the registration. So the first question is by Paul. The question is empathy not false and inferior to compassion, since we cannot know the emotional experience of others and it paralyzes us?
I'm going to have you read it one more time for us, if you don't mind, and not only for my sake, but for others, because we're splitting two different categories of emotion. I think it would be helpful if we hear that question one more time.
Yes. Is empathy not only false and inferior to compassion, since we cannot know the emotional experience of others and it paralyzes us?
Is it false? I don't think it can be false. At least with the definition we're working with today, trying to be in one other's, should we say, stand in somebody else's shoes, and then act appropriately with the knowledge that we have. I don't think that's false. Is it inferior? I would say it's actually the opposite from the way that we've defined it. It's actually more complex. One would have to have compassion that would fit then into empathy, and would have to understand that compassion. So I don't think that that it would be inferior. It would be built upon compassion. But I'm happy to have a dialogue on that, to go back and forth.
Maybe it would be good if we have and obviously we don't have it since this question was in the registration, but if we could define better compassion,
yes.
what we mean, or what Paul means, the person Paul, not the apostle.
Right.
What he means by compassion, maybe that would be helpful.
Yes, that would be. Yeah.
Well, I will jump to the next question from the registration, and for the participants, feel free to write other questions down in the chat, and I will ask them, or there is also the Q&A part in the app. Patty asks, sometimes in seeking to express empathy to someone in crisis, it is received as minimizing the pain. How can we avoid this?
Yeah. Perceived as minimizing the pain. Yeah, that's a very good question, Patty. And once again, I think we'll have to dialogue about this some. And when we empathize, we try and be in their situation and be in their another person's situation as much as possible. So I guess what I'm suggesting, that if it's ideal and we're empathizing, that it wouldn't diminish the way that another person would receive the ways that we're empathizing with them. It's this difficult trick with being in somebody else's skin, trying to project oneself into a situation, but not being able to be in it in total. Yeah, I mean, if it's communication, like, we can say, if we're just looking for communication, I don't understand. You could say something like, I may not fully appreciate your situation, but I had something similar myself, or struggled with this. For example, I serve as a pastor at a church here in the States, and I can empathize to a point when somebody has lost a loved one. I've lost loved ones. I've been with them in their final days, final moments. It's very difficult. Can I understand to a part? Yes, I think I can understand to a part. Can I understand in total? Maybe that's where you're going with this. Can we ever understand in total? But I guess there's a difference in going down the right direction rather than stopping short of it or going the opposite direction. So I think you've asked a very complex question, Patty. I'd be happy to go have some further dialogue about that. It'd be good.
I'm not sure. Am I listening? Are you hearing me?
Yes, I can hear you. Thank you.
Yes.
Okay. I guess I was thinking of someone in a situation I knew where the person had lost their father, and the friend had come along and in trying to express empathy was, saying ways that they had experienced loss and trying to empathize, but the person just kind of reacted, you win, you've lost people too. But it was a response of frustration, and as if they kind of slapped in the face, because how could anybody really understand the deep hurt that they were feeling? So I guess I just wanted your response to that kind of a situation. Personally, I feel like it's just there's a bit of a tension. We want to be empathetic, but we also, like you said, need to realize we can never really truly walk in that person's shoes, and to somehow communicate that to them, that how significant that is, whatever they're going through.
No, I think you said it very well. There may be a limit, but this building bridges, but maintaining a boundary, which fits in with empathy.
Yes, I agree.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you for sharing that. That's very good.
Greetings from Croatia, from Europe.
Wonderful.
Thank you for this presentation. I have one question. So what do you think? Do you see that this modern technology does that many people, especially young people, this Z generation, grow up rapidly in the, if I may say so, individualism, and that very emphasized individualism does that people cannot understand how empathy is important, if I made myself clear. Did you understand me?
Yeah, I think so.
And what do you suggest how to approach people, if especially to young people, to try to help them to understand that if they grow up in individualism, that individualism actually on the end make them very lonely persons. And so what do you suggest how to approach to help people?
Yeah, that's a great question, Oliver. I think this is exceedingly difficult. So with young people today, because they're coming into an experience that they assume that their reality is correct, and technology, I think, has changed the way that we communicate one with another, so that we're not communicating in the same ways that I'd say our grandfathers, our great grandfathers, or even the ancients have have communicated. Sometimes it's helpful just to say, provide some studies, not that this works with every person in every way, but there are a number of people out here who are saying that we are communicating differently now than we were before. And it's not just me as your youth leader or your father or your pastor or your teacher. A lot of people are saying this. Maybe you should consider that your communication's being inhibited. I mean, that's the direction. Another route, and I think we have to come back to this in some way, there has to be something said for consistent long-term relationships. Not every relationship that is deep and meaningful happens in just a month or a week or a few days. But there's the advantages that we have of communicating across the generations for a number of years, for being with classmates for many years and growing up. I think that might be some lever on this, Oliver, just to say, you know, we can communicate perhaps more in depth with people that we have quote, known all of our lives than somebody that we have only met for a brief amount of time. Those are just two things to think about. There probably some other ways. So, what do you think? Maybe we could have a little dialogue here.
I think that the biggest weapon is the communication, and so I'm not Z generation. I'm next year I will be 50. So, but I see that as a serious serious fruit of this age of technology, especially not just among the young generation, but among everybody. Mm-hmm. I see how myself I need to fight for empathy, to be empathetic toward people. So I think it's very important to speak about that, to share.
Yeah.
Yeah. So in the beginning was the word in every situation. So
yes.
Yeah. So I think that I don't know any way, but to be example, to know much better about that specific issue and to communicate.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
That's all my knowledge and skill in this time, in this moment.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
It's very tricky though, isn't it?
Yes, it is.
Yeah.
That's all from my point
maybe
of view.
Could give me a perspective on where you are in Croatia. Do people have long-term relationships in the area where you are in Croatia?
So Croatian people are very emotional. They like to talk. So talking for them is more important than food. To talk with other people. So they like to sit around and talk. But in the same time, as I see this era of technology damaged, if I may say so, young generation. So they do not know many of them, how to talk on a deeper level, if I may say so.
Yeah. That would fit in line with some of the studies I've read, where the answer to not having these valuable and deeper emotions like empathy is, at least learning to talk with each other, to keeping the conversation. Sherry Turkle, who's one book I've referred to about Alone Together, Why We Expect More from Technology and Less from Ourselves, has also written another about called Keeping the Conversation. And trying to find new and fresh ways to talk one with another. Yeah. So you're following along, at least in the line that she's proposing. Yeah.
Thank you, Oliver, for your question and for the conversation. I don't know if there are any more questions that anyone would like to ask. Just feel free to turn your mics on.
I should say to Oliver, I misquoted the book. The name of the book is Reclaiming Conversation, The Power of Talk in the Age.
Maybe I would like to ask one question, Drake.
Sure.
What are some ways or some disciplines, some practices that in our local communities, in local churches or youth groups, small groups, we can use to build this, the creation of this emotion, to build the sensibility of the people, to be more empathetic towards each other, to build community?
Great question. I mean, some of it I think is life experience and trying to be with others in various life experiences. Being with them when they're the happy times and truly rejoicing with them, as well as being with people when they're truly sad times. But now and then some various experiences over the years have helped open up areas like people used to read novels to do that, and as they would follow a character in a classic book, people's hearts would open up in different ways, and that could be a help. Sometimes reading emotional or accounts of history can open up things. Maybe travel can open up to appreciate others. There's a Vadim who is with us. Perhaps I know this Vadim, but I was in Ukraine in May, and I've read some Ukrainian books since then. And reading Ukrainian history helped me appreciate a lot more about not only Ukrainian people, but just about the ups and downs that people go through. So it could be books, could be experience, could be travels. Those are some suggestions. What do you think, Jose?
I think the books and novels, I think those are really, at least in my experience, those are things that really help me foster empathy. And yeah, I think conversations, as you were mentioning, just it's easy sometimes to have like our own perspective on some issue, but many times I think that especially when someone is doing something that I maybe consider not good, and it's easy to me to jump to conclusions why they are doing whatever they are doing, and many times in my experience, just talking to them and seeing the process, why they're doing what they're doing, it doesn't mean that what they did it was good. It's still bad, but it helps me better understand, okay, they are going through a hard time in their family, and that's why they reacted in this way. And it helps me to better understand and feel empathy. Like, I can understand why you did this, even though it's still wrong or it still hurts someone, but I can better understand you.
Good add-ons, thank you.
So one last time, if there is someone that would like to ask any questions, please feel free to join, turn on your mic, or write down a message, and we can have a little more discussion on this topic of empathy, how to build empathy.
Add on to what you said previously, Jose, I think sometimes we have to hold back our judgments. Maybe that's what you were saying, suggesting. You know, we just have to wait a little bit. Yeah, we have our opinions and the way that we see things, but maybe we're not seeing it completely in depth. Maybe we need to listen a little bit more.
Yes. Well, there is this old saying or proverb. I don't even know where it comes from, but probably you've heard it, that God gave us two ears and just one mouth, because we should listen twice as much as we talk. I find it very hard in my personal experience, but I really like the saying.
I empathize with you.
Even though it's really hard, it's I see that it's very easy to just very quickly jump to conclusions and judgment.
Yes.
Well, if there are no more questions, then we can finish this webinar. And once again, Drake, thank you very much for your time, for your wisdom, for your answers to the questions, and for the discussion you brought today on the topic of empathy and your study on 2 Corinthians. Thank you everyone who participated in this webinar. Thank you for also taking your time, sending your questions, and participating in this. Once again, it's been a pleasure to serve with you and to facilitate this webinar. Thank you very much for preparing this.
Thank you for your help, Jose. Always blessings to you and to everybody else. Thank you.